Sally Mayer.
Hold it, we didn't start it. Okay.
This is not directly relevant to your story.
No,
Again,
but
it's part of the JDC story.
Yeah, it's all right.
It must have been sometime around October or November. I think it was October 45, when I finally got word from the Paris office of the JDC. Yes, they had a large number of packages, good packages, JDC packages, in Switzerland, which Sally Mayer could make available to us, if I could get some Army vehicles to do it. And I was able to get the Army to loan us. You know, the Army, for all of our criticism of it, had many individuals who were quite sympathetic. One time, we had our camp, let me just digress again for a minute.
That's fine.
We had our camp DP police force to, they had real governing units within the DP camps run by the DP committee, and they had a police force of Jews, DPs, and they were issued guns in order to be a police force. We wanted to maintain law and order, we didn't want theft, and we tried to minimize the black marketeering and so forth. One time, the Army, in the middle of the night, raids our DP camp. This is while I was, I think, still in Bavaria. Still in the camp, although maybe, no, at this point I think I was already in Munich.
So when would this be?
So this would have had to be sometime around September or thereabouts.
1945.
Yeah, they were going to crack down on the black marketing, and the rumors were that the DPs, the Jewish DPs, were the crooks, and they did all the black marketing and whatnot. And so some group of MPs or whatnot, in the middle of the night, raided Feldafing and rousted the people out of their beds at gunpoint. You know, this was just the kind of memory these people in their condition needed at that point. And they searched and whatnot, and they found some Jews with guns. They arrested them. These were the DP police force. They had guns. Now, it was probably illegal under Army regulations, so they were arrested and put in jail. One of them was the chairman, or one of either the head or the number 2 guy of the camp committee, a very fine Lithuanian Jew named Joe Lifshitz, whom I met on the streets of Philadelphia in, like 1948 or something, and of whom, we became very close friends. He lives in California now. Joe and a number of others were arrested and put in jail, and since I had legal training, I quickly got a hearing or a trial organized before a military government judge in Bavaria, and he was a thoroughly decent, sympathetic guy, and he released them immediately. And there were, and he was, I don't know, his name, if I recall, was Sabo or something. He wasn't Jewish. And by the same token, I needed trucks to go to Sally Mayer's warehouse in Switzerland, and they gave me something like 16 big trucks that, not 2-tonners, I think, 4 tons, great big. And we went down, we drove down from Munich or some army base to the border of Germany and Switzerland, and Mayer had made arrangements for us to cross the border, and I remember driving through the Alps, and there was snow on the ground and whatnot to get there, and we spent a day loading the trucks, and Mayer gave each of the GI drivers a Swiss watch. They were all decent guys, and the experience was a good one. And we came back to Landsberg, and we unloaded this quite a decent shipment of supplies, and they were in Landsberg in a warehouse that we administered with Jewish DPs, and I think that was the first significant supplies that we had.
But you don't remember the type of packages that were sent in from...
Abe's packages, I knew they existed. I think he pretty much managed that himself. Now, if he says he turned it over to us, he might have done this after I had left.
Okay, possibly.
Because I left in December. Or if he turned them over, whether it was, did he say he turned them over in Feldafing or in Siebertstrasse?
I don't remember exactly where, but at a certain point,
the
feeling was because the joint had the had the warehouse that they turned it over to them and they administered it.
I don't know. I can't remember it. Again, I might.
Well,
But speaking of warehouses, I remember his telling me, and it was right fresh after the fact, how he had, at one time at least, gone to a warehouse and requisitioned the whole warehouse. It was some kind of army or German warehouse. He found it there. It was before I had arrived. He requisitioned the whole damn warehouse, took everything out of it. And I believe it. I don't know how big it was.
Now, were you ever involved in any of the illegal activities, for instance, the underground?
Not in Bavaria, that I know of. First of all, there weren't any.
He for instance,
yeah, go ahead.
He sent people in to the eastern part, Eastern Europe,
to bring people out.
People back. He forged documents.
Yeah.
Was the JDC ever involved in that, or do you remember his doing that type of thing? Were you involved in any way? Did you see it? Did you hear about it?
Well, it was relatively easy to move across frontiers in those days. There was real chaos, as I said, of communications, controls, different armies at different borders, German civilian control, anybody, and Jews were moving back and forth across the borders. I know that we had people who left our Feldafing and who came back after a while and said, I've been to Poland. I came back again. And these Jews particularly, who had managed to survive deep concentration camps, knew how to do things of that sort. I'm sure there must have been, U.S. Army-looking documents that Abe must have given people. If he said he did, I wouldn't have any reason to doubt it. I just don't remember specifically.
But I'm not trying to suggest that I disagree with what he said.
I know what you...
Simply trying to find as many people as possible who can attest to that fact.
Yeah. I cannot, again, I can't remember it specifically.
Okay.
But we did not do that. Again, this sort of requirement that we operate within a legal framework and not jeopardize our status. We once sent a group back that wanted to go back, I think, to Budapest from the DP camps. We had quite a few Hungarians and Romanians in Feldafing at one point, and a transport was organized. At that point, the Army thought everybody would want to go home, and the camps would evaporate, and the Hungarian and Romanian Jews didn't have a strong Zionist tradition at that point, and some of them did want to go back. And I remember the Army or UNRWA had organized a trainload, and I think we had some role in that. And Dr. Haitan went with that train, at least to the borders, and but I think some of those people came back again later. But that was, again, a legal operation. I have a feeling Dr. Haitan did things. He could do that without telling me, And I really, at that point, knew very little about that if we were doing it. Now, of course, at a different level, Joe Schwartz was transferring money and moving back and forth across frontiers, and he was a master at evading some of the restrictions during World War II, particularly. But I can't remember that.
Fine. Were you involved in Aliyah Bet at all?
Only in Berlin, not in Bavaria.
When we get to the next chapter, I suppose we'll get to that. Were you involved with the Jewish Agency?
In Berlin. I met Ruth Kluger in Paris while I was still there with the JDC.
This was before you went to...
Before I went into Bavaria.
Yeah.
This would have been in May or June. She was already there for the Sochnut, and she came in to talk to us several times, and that's when I first met Ruth. And it's possible that I may have seen her in that 5 or 6 month period that I was in Bavaria.
Okay.
But I cannot remember it specifically. I suspect, I know we had some American visitors during that time to Bavaria. Rabbi Israel Goldstein, as I recall, came to Bavaria. And, but I don't think that, I'm sure there must have been some Jewish Agency people too.
But in other words, you weren't involved with them in any professional level? They
No.
never called upon you to help them in any way.
I don't think they did in Bavaria. They probably were around Siebertstrasse.
Were you ever involved with the chaplain to collect guns or ammunition
No.
or money to
No.
Palestine?
No.
Okay.
I think some of our people in Berlin were involved in that.
All right. Now, we've dealt with Rabbi Klausner. If there's anything else that you wanted to say before we go ahead with somebody else?
Well, just turn this off for a minute. Let me think. Apropos Rabbi Klausner and whether my involvement with him might jeopardize my own position, I'm quite sure I had to think of that. I could not jeopardize the whole role of the JDC in Germany. In retrospect, I can't imagine that the Army, particularly in the view of later events, with the complete Army support and sympathy for the DP program, that anything would have been done to us. But at that time, I had a feeling of a very unfriendly Army. We didn't yet have the sort of clear indication of support and friendliness that came later. So I'm sure I was on my guard.
But that's interesting because many of the chaplains said that during the first period, after the war, that because so many of the soldiers had seen what they had liberated and what the condition of the Jews, that they were very sympathetic. Whereas in a later point, when some of these combat troops had gone home and they were replaced, or other troops were there, they obviously wouldn't have been replaced, but other troops who were there would fraternize with the Germans and became, at least on the lower level, they became more sympathetic in many respects to the German situation, because the Germans would tell them, you see, this is the way the Jews live, and this is what they did to us, etc.
Well, the chaplains had much more contact with the troops than I did. I am talking of the upper echelon people, and it may be that in those first 3 months before I arrived, there was more sympathy even from the upper echelon people. By the time I got there, and I was dealing with guys like Major Fisher, there was this feeling clearly that these people are a nuisance to us. They're creating problems for us. They were also, you see, the DPs would have been more submissive in the first few months. They were now beginning to assert themselves and to feel their oats, and therefore could be less attractive from the Army point of view than when they were quite submissive and able to be helped without protest or without making any claims.
But on the higher levels,
at the higher levels, in my early days in Bavaria, I felt certainly that I was dealing with people who were less than friendly in Patton's 3rd Army headquarters.
well, Patton in particular was known for his anti-Semitism.
Yes.
So
Well, I don't know. I can't say. I know he has some history of that. All I found was
or lack
some
of
guys.
sympathy
Yeah,
in any event.
yeah. All I found were some Army guys of the type I've described to you who didn't have any real sympathy for this. And now, later on, particularly with the Rifkins and the Bernsteins and so forth, who were influencing upper level generals, and also the political flowback from the States, I suspect some of this had filtered down to next to the top echelon. But in those early days, I felt that we did not have a sympathetic army in Bavaria. Berlin, General Clay in Berlin was a friend.
Yeah. Now, if there's nothing else on this aspect about either Rabbi Klausner or Rabbi Browdy, then maybe we should go on to the second period, when you were in Berlin with Rabbi Friedman, Rabbi Shubo, and Rabbi Abramowitz.
Was Shubo in Berlin? I think maybe he was.
My feeling was that I don't remember.
I think maybe he was.
Yeah,
I think that's where I met him. Yeah.
Fine.
Now, I've forgotten the sequence.
Okay.
Was it Friedman, Shubo, and Abramowitz, or?
Well, Friedman was there around the same time that Abramowitz was there.
Yeah. Then they succeeded. Abramowitz then came in while Friedman was still there. Perhaps Shubo was there first when I arrived. I arrived in Berlin, as I mentioned. I had gone home in December 45, expecting to stay home. I went back in January 46 and spent another 13 or 14 months in Germany. Incidentally, after that, I still couldn't leave the JDC work, and I stayed on with the JDC office in New York as its sort of house counsel for another 2 or 3 years, where I worked on restitution problems and other work that the JDC was involved in. But I went back, and Phil Skornick had been the first JDC director in Berlin, and he had come back to the States, and I replaced him. And he had already managed, because of Berlin's location, to have supplies brought in from Denmark across Germany into Berlin to an extent that we had not yet been able to accomplish in Bavaria when I had left Bavaria. They were just nearer to the sources of supply to these Scandinavian countries that had been neutral countries during the war. That was the important thing. I mean, Sweden. They brought in supplies from Sweden, as I recall. So we already had a going program when I got there, and we had one DP camp, Schlachtensee, which had an UNRWA team in there, headed by a fellow named Fishbein, the brother of the famous Morris Fishbein of the American Medical Association. And I don't know whether Fishbein came in after I did, but anyway, there was an UNRWA team in Schlachtensee, and later a second UNRWA...
AMA, was that the
American Medical Association, yeah. Dr. Morris Fishbein. His brother. And later another camp was established in the American sector of Berlin, and those two camps at any one time might house 3,000 or 4,000 people. The second one was smaller. And in addition, we had in the French sector of Berlin was divided into 4 sectors. Berlin proper. The area around us was all Russian zone of Berlin, of Germany. But Berlin proper had 4 powers, each had its own sector. We had 2 DP camps eventually in the American sector, which, as I say, could house 4 or 5 people at one time. Incidentally, the head of the camp committee in Schlachtensee, a fellow named Schwartzberg, lives here in Berlin, in Philadelphia now, and could probably tell you something from his point of view of the 2 chaplains in Berlin. He's quite a guy.
What's his name, his first name?
Schwartzberg. His first name, I think the English is Harry. He might still have... I haven't seen him for 5 years or so. He was last running a sort of a grocery market, grocery and meat market in the basement of the Park Lane apartment house over in near Lincoln Drive on Harvey Street. Maybe we can look him up. He would tell you of his experiences with the Jewish chaplains in Berlin. But in addition to those 2 camps, there was a camp in the French sector of Berlin. It was sort of a little overnight transient camp that that had been started, I think, before I arrived there, probably by Phil Skornick or with his help, but really basically started by the Bricha. This was a camp, the name escapes me. It was just an apartment building, about 3 or 4 stories high, and it ran a half a block or so. And they had taken it over. The French apparently had permitted them to. And it was sort of the first stop in the Underground Railroad, bringing Jews out of Poland into Berlin, which, as I mentioned, was one of the 2 main entry points from Poland in 1946. And in the early part of 46, it was not a big trickle, but then when you had the Kelchi pogrom and the return of the Russian Jews, of the Polish Jews from the Soviet Union with some Soviet Jews, in the summer of 46 particularly, we had, I think I said 6,000 a week. 3,000 a week would be more accurate. I think the maximum we had at any one time was 3,000 a week. Coming in on the backs of trucks, the whole operation engineered and run by the Bricha, and I think I went into this at some length in my tape for Yehuda Bauer several years ago. And we quickly got to know these Bricha boys. They were all former members of the Jewish Brigade in the British Army who had gotten demobilized or surreptitiously in Germany. They'd given their uniforms, as you know, to DPs, who then went back to Israel as British soldiers. And these very wonderful guys operating in that sector. For them, Berlin was an important point. And in running the truckloads of people from Poland across the Russian sector of Russian zone of Germany, with the bribery of the Russian authorities and the Polish authorities, who were glad to get rid of the Jews anyway, they came through Stettin into Berlin. The first stop, they would come in at night. The first stop would be at this little camp or stopover point in the French sector of Berlin. It was a vital point because the British, for example, were not about to look the other way, and they were constantly making trouble with the French. Didn't care very much, but the British were making trouble for both the Americans and the French about this illegal flow. And so in order for the French and the Americans to look the other way, we had to make it as covert an operation as possible. The Bricha had to. So they found this place. They came in first into the French sector, across the Russian zone. People would be in the back of open trucks often. And they'd come into the borders of Berlin, and before they might be intercepted by one of these four-man or teams of police MPs from each army, which would mean a British MP would be among them, and you could never be sure whether you could trust some individual American MP or French. They wanted to get the people unloaded, and this place was found near the border of Berlin in the French sector, and that's where people would be unloaded for the first night. And at any one time we could have several hundred people, 500 or 600 people. Well, to get 3,000 in a week, yeah, we could have as many as 500 or 600 people. Not all of them stopped there. Some somehow went right directly into the American sector. But a whole lot of them stopped there, and they'd stay for a few days. And we had a nucleus of about a dozen Polish Jewish DPs, concentration camp survivors, who ran that operation for us. And the JDC furnished all of the supplies for that. It was, it was not an official program at all. It was not an official camp. It was just an apartment house. We kept them totally supplied, and we helped furnish sometimes the transportation. What would happen is, after the people rested there for a day or two, they would then, in daylight, move into the American sector, and they would be much less noticeable in all the traffic and all that. People were always moving around on the backs of trucks. They'd be, somehow in daylight it was safer, and the Americans knew what was going on and couldn't care less. I mean, by then we had, real good liaison between a Phil Bernstein and a McInerney, General McInerney, who was an absolute complete friend, thanks to the influence of people like Phil Bernstein. And then they'd stay in Schlachtensee, in the American sector of Berlin, and from there the Army would give us trucks, and periodically they'd be transported to the West Germany, either to Bavaria or to Frankfurt or the American zone of West Germany, not to the British zone. And the British would protest periodically and whatnot, because from Bavaria, eventually they'd go down to Italy and move on to Israel. Well, this operation could not help but involve the chaplains in Berlin also. Now, the JDC's role was not only to furnish supplies for this camp, this transient point. What's the name of it? It escapes me. It's probably in Yehuda Bauer. I'm sure it's in Yehuda Bauer's book. Not only to completely furnish supplies for that operation, but a guy named Max Helvarg, who is...
Yes, I met him.
Did you?
Sure.
All right. Max was on my staff in Berlin. He had been there with the Army and had somehow gotten... He and a fellow named Eisenberg. First Eisenberg had somehow gotten assigned to the JDC operation in Berlin under Phil Skornick from the Army. I think they got demobilized in some way. And then Max Helvarg, also in that same role. Now, Max, I know got guns for the bricha, and he wouldn't tell me. I shouldn't know. I was the official head. And we did get supplies for the bricha. They needed stuff for bribery purposes and whatnot, for their own purposes. And we saw quite a lot of the bricha, and they were past masters. They quickly learned how to operate. Again, it was still a chaotic period. It was not difficult to cross borders illegally. It was gradually tightening up, but they were very daring, and some of them got caught and spent some time in prison. I think eventually they got back. I remember they all had assumed names. Like there was a guy named Nachman, and eventually I saw him in Haifa I went to Palestine in the spring, in April of 1947, when I finally left the JDC, and I think I looked him up either at that point or the following summer when I took a UJA delegation over. But they were just absolutely great guys. And now, in the American sector of Berlin was the Jewish Chaplain Center. This was an official function. We had a chaplain, and he was entitled to have a place for the GIs who were stationed in Berlin. We had quite a few troops in Berlin, and the American sector was ours to govern, the Americans to govern. AMGUS was there, Office for Military Government, U.S. Zone of Germany. General Clay, all the top, for the whole German program, headquarters were in Berlin. Mm-hmm. And there were office people and all sorts of people, and it was a natural place for the DPs to congregate too. Now it was just a small building, you couldn't have large numbers of them, but they were constantly in the DP camps. They had constant dealings with the Bricha boys too. Now a lot of it was just social, we were all engaged in something. We were tremendously full of admiration of these Bricha boys, and I met in Germany the summer before last. We were in Germany a year ago last July and August, and I met for the first time the guy who was the head of that program while I was there. I've got it written down somewhere. In fact, he's written a couple of books, probably not very good, on the subject, but I met him, as a matter of fact, when I took a trip once on my own with a Bricha transport from southern Poland into Czechoslovakia, and I met him at one of the transfer points. He said he was the fire chief of Tel Aviv visiting Poland to study firefighting methods. A real operator, and I got his name. I just met him again in all those years. I met him that time in it must have been December 1946, and I saw him 2 years ago in Tel Aviv. We had a coffee together, because another guy whom I met and who had been in the operation told me about him. Anyway, the Chaplain Center was a place where I'm sure Shubo must have been part of that too. But the Bricha program became most important in 46. Now Shubo may have been there only in the first part of 46 and then left. And it was in the summer of 46 that it was a very dramatic experience. And if Herb Friedman, for example, needed any more motivation to go on, to finally leave the rabbinate and spend full time on these things, he got it there, plus his later experiences with Phil Bernstein. And he and Mike Abramowitz were both excellent for this kind of role.
Do you remember exactly what they were doing? Do you remember experiences that they were involved in?
We were very close. We would see each other constantly. We'd see each other in the camps. I would be at their place. They would be at our place. There was a good deal of smuggling of Russian Jews out. Some of them were in the Russian army, stationed in Berlin. Again, the Bricha did some of this. This was risky stuff. The Russians might not care if you smuggle some Jews out of Poland, civilians, but the Russian soldiers, Russian civilians, that was a little more serious. I know the Bricha did some of that. For all I know, they might even have hidden some Russian Jews. I think they did, as a matter of fact. I think they had some Russian Jews staying at their place a few times. The extent of their involvement with the Bricha, they would have to tell you. But I suspect it was, fairly significant. They didn't have the kind of supplies we had.
Right.
By that time, we had a lot of supplies. We had a big warehouse, but in terms of, I'm sure they had contacts with American Army, Jewish Army officers, and maybe non-Jewish, but mostly Jewish officers who could have helped in situations. But they would have to tell you. All I know is that it was it was really an important part of the scene, that chaplaincy. They